Good evening, everybody. My name is Heather Gores. I'm with Historic Resources Group, and I'm going to be leading the presentation tonight. I just want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank city staff for having us. We actually really enjoy doing community outreach, as a matter of fact, because every one of us here who is a consultant came into this profession because we love historic buildings, and most of us have a favorite building that we wanted to save. And that was what started us out on this path. So we really enjoy the opportunity to hear from the community about what is important to them. And we are happy that you care, quite honestly. And the fact that you are here tonight is evidence of that. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for giving up some of your pandemic Netflix binge watching time to come and talk with us about what is important to you. And we're happy to have you. I'm not going to talk for too long, but I did just want to give you a quick overview of the project and what our particular task consists of at this time. And then we want to open up the floor to hear more from you about what is important to you in Alhambra. Especially if it will let me advance my slides. One second. So I just wanted to introduce us all. Like I said, my name is Heather. I am a senior architectural historian with Historic Resources Group, and I've been with HRG for about 8 years. And I work on a number of different kinds of projects, and context statements are some of my favorite because it really is an opportunity to tell the story of a community. And we are here not just as professionals, but as students of your community. And this is a privilege for us to be here and be guests in your homes and find out more about what is important to you and what the story of your community is. And with me tonight are Molly Eichert-Johnson, who is our architectural historian and our staff photographer. She is also a crack website designer. She designed the social media content for this project. And she's going to be monitoring our chat room tonight. So if you have questions or comments on anything that you see or anything that we talk about tonight, please feel free to ping us in the chat box, and Molly is ready to respond to you. And we also have with us tonight our intern, Ani Mnatsakayan. And she actually just finished her master's thesis. So she will be monitoring the comments as well and taking notes for us. So feel free to pop in and say hi to both of them. And congratulations to Ani on a very long and hard work and on her thesis. We also have Robbie Orangaran, who is our planning associate and our mapping specialist. He created the maps that you'll see tonight. And also Christine Lazaretto is the managing principal on this project. So there are probably some of you out there who are thinking, thank God that they're finally thinking about doing a historic context statement. And there are probably others of you that are thinking, what is a historic context statement? What are we even talking about? And so my job is to talk to both of you and explain a little bit more about what we're doing. The historic context statement is actually a very important part of the historic preservation planning process. And it really is the first step in that process. It's the first step in establishing a comprehensive historic preservation program. And some of the subsequent steps in that process include the establishment of a Historic Resources Commission, which I was told was formally approved this past week. So congratulations on that. And then a completion of a historic resources survey and the development of a historic preservation ordinance. So the context statement is really the first in a line of steps that help guide the city in making decisions regarding preservation planning. And what this does is it establishes some baseline documentation regarding existing potential historic resources and the context of their development that helps planning staff guide decision-making and the future treatment of those historic resources and how you might shape a historic preservation program that responds to those particular issues. So a historic context statement is kind of the baseline document that highlights the important trends and patterns that are important to understanding the history of your community and the history of the built environment that you see today. There are a couple of components to a historic context statement. One is the narrative statement itself. One is the windshield survey of all properties built through 1980. And one is the community outreach program, which is part of what we're doing tonight. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about all three of those things. And the first is the narrative context statement, which is usually what we refer to and what we're talking about when we think of historic context statements in general. So what is a historic context statement? What do they do? What is their purpose? A historic context statement is a written document that provides the framework for evaluating a property for historic significance and integrity. And that sounds like a very technical definition, but essentially what it does is it's a document that addresses the entire history of the area that lies within Alhambra's city limits, and it discusses each significant phase of development for the built environment. So essentially any buildings that you see today. And it talks about how those buildings and those development patterns that shape those buildings have evolved over time by chronological period. And within those periods are relevant themes that are based on type of development or certain influences that may have shaped patterns of development. A historic context statement, what it is not, is a comprehensive history. There are several very comprehensive histories of the city of Alhambra, and we do not intend to replace them. They're very ably drafted in their own right. What we are focused on specifically is the built environment. And so the purpose of our project is to highlight trends and patterns within the history that relate to the built environment and help us understand what contributed to the construction that you see today. So we won't, there will be things in the context statement that will not necessarily be addressed, that you may be looking for certain elements of the history, but what we really try to focus on is what contributed to the built environment that you see today, because ultimately what we want this document to do is to guide planning decisions related to the built environment. That's the most important part. When we start to think about how we want to explore the history of a community and develop a narrative historic context statement, we do a lot of thinking about how to approach this from a research methodology standpoint. The first step in this process is research. We want to gather as much information as we possibly can to understand your community as best we can before we start to approach any kind of windshield survey or drafting of a document with any kind of eligibility standards. We really want to understand what we're looking at. So we do a lot of research before we even put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, just to make sure that we have a comprehensive understanding of what's happened in Alhambra. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about methodology and how some of those sources help inform our work. And I'll say in this particular instance, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had a slightly more unique situation in terms of research than what we typically face in terms of challenges and availability of materials. But we were able to do much of our research online. And thankfully, because of digitization, many of those materials are available. If you know of something, a particular book, a particular newspaper, a particular photographic collection that you think we should not miss, then please drop that in the chat as well, because I am a researcher at heart, first and foremost, and I like to cover as many bases as possible. And we're going to talk a little bit as well about some of the sources that were most informative to us and some of the things that we learned. In primary and secondary literature, this is a really common review when we're essentially looking at books and articles and periodicals that were published both during the periods of development that we're looking at and also in retrospect in terms of secondary histories. One of the most unique examples that we found was a master's thesis that was developed by Margaret Lee. It was called The History of Alhambra up to 1915. And what was particularly unique about this in our minds was the fact that it was drafted very early. It was developed in 1935. And so for us, that's a particular valuable piece of information because it is as close to the source of the information and as close to those original time periods as we can possibly get. And so there's usually a lot less room for error when we can get source documents that are very close to the original development period. One of the other things that we look at and really try to take a deep dive into is existing surveys and assessments of potential historic resources. And Alhambra was actually subject to a historic resources survey in 1984 and 1985. And this really gave us a wealth of information about what was considered historic at the time of survey. And the thing to remember about surveys is that they represent a particular point in time when the survey occurred. So what this gives us is a representative picture of historic resources in 1985 in Alhambra. So obviously many things have changed since 1985. And one of those things is survey methodology. And I think today we have a much more sophisticated understanding of how to look at historic resources and how to evaluate them. So while this is a very valuable document for us, we would certainly take this as baseline information and expand upon it to make sure that we are evaluating properties in the most in-depth and comprehensive way, but also that we are sensitive to new ways of looking at significance that may not have been considered in the 1980s. For instance, we talk a lot more now about intangible significance, types of importance to different communities and different cultural groups that may not have been examined in the 1980s. That survey was particularly focused on residential communities, in particular single-family residential communities. And we often look now when we do these types of projects at all of the resources in a community. So that means both residential properties as well as commercial buildings, industrial buildings, institutional examples like libraries, city hall, and also we look at landscapes. And so we try to use this as a baseline document to inform our research going forward, but we certainly would encourage you to look at it with a nuanced eye for what it is at the time and what it gives us to look towards. Maps are also extremely important in this process, particularly because of how Alhambra changed and evolved over time. It annexed quite a bit of land in subsequent decades, and that changed both the character of the community and the character of development. And so I wanted to show you a little bit of what we have found in terms of maps that have been helpful. The top left that you see here is actually a composite map that shows the property of the Lake Vineyard Land and Water Association in 1876. The bottom map here is actually from 1903 and is a real estate atlas that shows the land as it was purchased and owned in Alhambra in 1903. The middle map, which is very colorful, is actually an irrigation map that shows water lines that were run in Alhambra around 1888. And the upper right here shows a city map with, I believe, rail lines that dates from 1922. And then a land use map down here in the lower right from 1936 and 1937. And this one in particular is really interesting to us to see how the land use evolved over time and what that told us about the changing character of the city as it evolved away from being an agricultural settlement to a more commercialized and industrialized area. And of course, they're always fun to look at. So we always like to have a chance to show people what we found in terms of maps. They really do tell the story in a different way. So when we start to think about drafting the historic context statement, we want to define the scope in a way that is really useful for looking at the built environment. So since we're looking at trends and patterns of development activity across time in the history of Alhambra, We want to make sure that the chronological periods of development that we're looking at cover the most significant patterns of development in the city. So in this case, we're looking from the founding of the city and its inception in 1875 up to 1980. And it's fairly common nowadays to examine properties through survey up to 1980 because the National Register threshold for eligibility is 50 years of age or older. And the National Register and the National Park Service guidance that's developed for the National Register both recommend that you start to survey properties around 40 years of age. And that's been established through Survey LA as well. So we have adopted similar guidelines just to remain consistent with the recommended guidance. We also look at all types of properties because it's not just homes or it's not just commercial buildings that tell the story of a community, it's everything. And so we look at single family homes, we look at bungalow courts, we look at commercial properties, and that may mean theaters, it may mean ice cream parlors, it may mean sewing shops, it may mean clothing stores, department stores, film theaters. We look at all kinds of resources. Industrial properties tell a very different story, but one that is equally important. A lot of times industrial properties may have been developed adjacent to the city boundaries, but then became part of the city later on. So that tells us a different story about how those areas functioned. And institutional properties as well are very important. Libraries, city halls, any kind of municipal buildings give us an idea of how the community was establishing itself as a city and how they were making improvements and how they were functioning as a municipality. So all of these different property types tell us different stories that help contribute to the story of Alhambra in a whole. And that's really what we hope to convey. These are a list of the draft themes that we developed based on our identification of development patterns through research. And you can actually review these in the draft historic context statement outline, which is right now available online on our website. And I'll show you how to access that towards the end here. But we typically focus largely on periods that are associated with more examples of physical development, so building activity. But in this case, we also include narrative related to the initial history and development of the area under Native American settlement and European exploration, because we don't want to skip that story. We tend to focus most of the discussion on periods of physical development because we are focusing on the built environment today. But there are obviously some trends and activities that occurred prior to that that are important in understanding the history of the land, and we don't want to ignore those. So there will be a discussion of Native American settlement and European exploration and also Spanish and Mexican rule, but those areas will be slightly more brief than the others where we discuss more patterns of physical development that are visible today. Through our research, we developed a really solid understanding of how the landscape of the city evolved over time. And in part that had to do with how the city expanded to form its current boundaries today. And what was really impressive to us is that Alhambra really came to take on its current form through a number of annexations. There was the original incorporation in 1903, and then there were subsequent annexations in 1908, 1917, 1926, 1941, 1944, 1945, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 53, 55, 57, 64, 78, and 89. And while that sounds like a really long list, when we started to look at the areas that were annexed per decade and where those annexations were located, it gave us a really good idea of where we might anticipate seeing new construction dating from that period as these areas were annexed into the city. And it also gave us an idea of what kind of development activity was taking place at the time. There were obviously periods where annexations were occurring more often than others, and finding out the reasons behind that is part of what helps inform our examination of the buildings that we see today. This is another example of some of the maps that we draft, and this is a map that shows all of the different tracts that were established in Alhambra over time. And obviously many of those, there is no color code to this map, I should say. What you see here is just we used different colors for each tract to help distinguish the boundaries between them. There is not necessarily an order to what you're seeing. But it does go to show you how different areas developed in different ways. Obviously, there were some areas that developed in a more piecemeal fashion with smaller tracts, and there were some areas that were more representative of large-scale development. Typically, those areas corresponded to residential development, usually from the post-war era. But it gives us an idea as we start to look at this map where we might see concentrations of similar construction or similar types of buildings based on tract boundaries. We also did some research into the developers of tracts. And one of the things that struck us is that unlike many communities, say from the 20s and 30s in Southern California, that were developed wholesale by large-scale real estate developers, most of Alhambra's early tracts were really developed by individuals who were subdividing their original parcels from the first community settlement, and they were subdividing their own land. It wasn't really until much later that you started to see the kind of wholesale large-scale development that characterized other communities. And you can see a lot of this piecemeal development in through here, which then transitioned to developments more like this in later years. So that gives us an idea of who are the major players in development in Alhambra? How is the town getting built up? Are we looking at large-scale developers like Henry Huntington, or are we looking at people who are subdividing their own lots and they may just be making 10 residential parcels and leaving it at that? So it starts to give us a little bit more of the story behind how the land took shape. This is one of our favorite maps to show. This represents development in Alhambra by decade. And this map was developed by our mapping specialist, Robbie, using GIS data and tax assessor data. So what he is able to do is take data from the tax assessor that records the year built for each parcel and then map that geographically. So when we look at the city as a whole, we can immediately see, just based by color, what areas of the city may have been constructed in each decade, which gives us, based on our research, a very good idea of the character of that development. Post-war development is obviously going to be very different than pre-war development. But when we look at this map and we can see that there was quite a bit of development in the 40s and 50s in this particular area, we have an idea of what we expect that development to look like. Same over here. We can also tell based on these large swaths of color that date from later periods like the 40s and the 50s, that these were areas we should expect to be areas of redevelopment at that time that likely had some kind of original development on them that was redeveloped for residential use. And that turned out to be true, of course. One of these areas is the site of the former airport, and the other is the site of the former Midwick Country Club, both of which were redeveloped as residential parcels in the years following the war. So it really starts to clue us in as to what to look at in the next step of the project when we start approaching the windshield survey phase. We want to know what we're looking at, what we can expect to look at, what we can expect to find, and that helps inform our decision-making and how we make recommendations in the narrative. And I just wanted to share this with you. This is a sort of rough cut of our study map for the windshield survey. Once we've conducted a lot of our research and we've begun to draft the report and get an understanding of what the different development periods represent, what kind of activity was taking place during those periods, we want to go out in the field and see how that translates to the built environment and see how that translates to what we're seeing today. So we draw on all of our research and we draw on those existing surveys and previous assessments that I mentioned to develop what we call a survey study map. And the survey study map is really a compilation, not necessarily of things that we have identified, but things that have been previously identified as potentially historic. So most of the buildings from the 1984-1985 survey were added to this map, as well as a number of residential neighborhoods that had been identified in the city by the city in a previous general plan. To help give us an idea of when we're driving through the city and we're doing our windshield survey, where might we expect to see potential historic resources? Where have other people identified potential historic resources? So we can look at those with a bit more of a nuanced eye and know that we should take a second look to either confirm that they're still there, confirm that they have not been altered substantially, and that they reflect the character of the previous assessments. So this is a representative example of the kind of map that we take into the field with us when we start that survey to help inform what we're looking at. Following the windshield survey, which was actually completed this summer, you may have seen Robbie and Molly driving around town, and Ani was with them, I know, on a few occasions. We go back to the drawing board and we look to define more specifically our periods of development. And typically, sometimes those define themselves based on what we know of the chronology development about the city and where certain milestones occurred over time. But also sometimes we look at types of development and how those occurred over time. Is there a particular time period where we only saw a certain kind of development? That may guide us towards defining a particular period. World War II is usually a major milestone, in particular because most construction was halted during World War II to redirect manufacturing efforts towards the war. So a lot of times there's a huge pause in development between 1941 and 1945. And when development activity returns in the years following the war, it's usually drastically different in character, partially because of the manufacturing processes and the mass production techniques that were developed during the war. But in Alhambra's case, because it was such an industrial center at that point, we actually did have examples of development that were constructed during the war. And so we wanted to make sure that we allowed for that as well. But there were certainly periods that were very clearly defined based on how the city was growing, and that its very early years of operation were different than how development activity was taking place when it matured. So we wanted to define this in a way that was responsive to both the trends that we saw historically and also that were evident in the built environment today. So we are now in the process of reviewing that draft historic concept statement. We actually have an outline of the draft available for public review, and you can see I've included a screen cap for the website down here. If you visit the website, which is historicalhambra.com, you will see there's a tab at the top that says Documents. And if you click on that tab, you'll be able to go down and there is actually a link to the historic context statement outline. That is the document that we are inviting you to review right now, and we would love to hear your comments on that. In mid-November, we will have released a draft of the actual historic context statement for your review as well. And then we'd like to hear your feedback on that in early December at the second outreach meeting. And then we will revise that draft based on your input and present that in mid-January. If you have read the draft based on the previous link here, or maybe you have stumbled upon it yourself, we genuinely really would like to hear what you think, because again, we are students in your city. We certainly have a great deal of experience in how to conduct these surveys and draft these narratives, but every city is different and every city has its own story. And we are anxious to make sure that that story reflects what you consider historic and what is important to you about your community. And so I would love to see everyone click on the link and take a look at the outline. If you go to the website, and the web address is up here. On the main page, if you scroll down, there is a link that says submit your feedback on the draft historic context statement outline. You can click that link directly and it will take you to a feedback form where you can submit whatever comments you like. If you love it, we want to know. If you hate it, we also want to know. I promise our feelings will not be hurt, but we really are anxious to make this the best reflection that we can of what is important in Alhambra, and we need your help to do that. So I hope that you'll consider submitting your thoughts, and just like we're anxious to hear from you tonight, we are anxious to see what you have to say about this document. And if you have any suggestions at all, we are happy to listen. And that brings it, we want to hear from you, and not just about the draft context statement outline, but we want to hear from you about buildings and your community. And I will say up front, it's most helpful if those buildings are still standing. However, if there are buildings in the history of Alhambra that you remember that are particularly important in your experience in the city and how you look at the history and character of this town, then we absolutely want to know about those as well. But just please perhaps note that they are no longer there, because sometimes with general addresses and things, we might try to hunt something down that turns out not to be there anymore, and then we will be heartbroken as well. So we are very anxious to hear about what you're interested in. And a lot of times we get questions about, what sort of building should I tell you about? What do you want to know? And it's never very helpful for us to say everything, although we really do mean it. But we are particularly interested in the lesser known places that shaped your community. And these might be places that are important for a broad range of reasons. The National Park Service has developed criterion around which you can evaluate whether or not a property is eligible. But what we are really curious about right now is what properties are merely important to you and that you feel are important to the story of Alhambra and its history. So that may be buildings, it may be landscapes, it may be particular trees, it may be properties that are associated with an important person, a social, cultural, or ethnic group, an important type of development, like a major residential neighborhood in the 1950s. We want to know. And I found these caricatures. We were talking about important individuals in town, and I found these in a magazine from 1911. And I was just tickled because I thought this really makes it so easy for us to determine who the important individuals are at the time. But what I also know, looking at that, is that this is not what Alhambra looks like today. There is much more to the story of Alhambra than the number of men who came to town as boosters and built the economy. And so while we are as interested in knowing about these people, I also want to know about the people who are not in these pictures and the other kinds of communities that may have played roles that are not as well documented. Because while we are anxious to discuss those and document them in the narrative, it can be really challenging because the historical record doesn't always reflect them to the same degree. And that's why we rely on the participation of the community to make sure that we capture what really is important, even if no one has documented that before. So we have some questions here. You can kind of think about properties that you know of that may fit these criteria, or properties that do not at all. We still want to hear about them. It's certainly, don't burden yourself about whether or not something is important enough. We certainly are just anxious to hear more about the stories that you are familiar with and that are important to you, so we can help shape a narrative that accurately reflects your city and the history and what is important to the community. So please feel free to hit that submit button. And I can show you how here. Again, if you go to the website at historicalhambra.com, there will be another tab in the corner that says Get Involved. And if you click on that, there are 3 different ways to submit your building suggestions, your property suggestions, or even if you have a particular person in mind. And you can print out the form, you can complete it online, and then you can actually click and view and see what your neighbors have submitted. And we're very excited to start getting feedback from people as word of the website spreads. So we've been able to put some up already, but certainly check it out and it may give you some ideas of your own. You can also contact us through email at historicalhambra@thecityofalhambra.org. And we've also been folded into the city's social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So you will see posts about what we are working on there as well. So I would like to open it up now to questions from you all, whether that is about the historic context statement, whether it's about things in the history of Alhambra, what we've been researching, what we saw on our windshield survey days when we were out over the summer, anything and everything. We are here to listen to you, and I'm happy that you gave us the time. So if we have any questions, Molly, I'm happy to take those.
So far, we don't have any questions. For the most
Okay.
part, we've gotten some great submissions so far.
Fantastic.
One of our attendees would like to know where we can access the photos that you've uncovered.
So I will tell you, photo research, much like map research, is one of my favorite parts of these projects. And I actually, we consulted a number of online resources. In particular, because of COVID, we knew that we were not going to be able to go to as many repositories as we might usually visit. So in this case, I will read these off very quickly, but also maybe we can put a list on the website. Molly, you and I can talk about this, of some of the major historical photo resources. But our historical photographs and the maps were obtained online from these sites, which were included, but were not limited to the California Historical Society, the California State Library, the California State University Monterey Bay Library, David Rumsey Historical Map Collection, Huntington Library, the Library of Congress, Los Angeles Public Library, the Online Archive of California, the Pasadena Museum of History, the University of California at Berkeley, University of California at Los Angeles, and the University of Southern California. I will say, as a general rule, if you are looking to cast a broad net for historical photographs, one of the best places that you can go in California, we're very lucky to have this, is a website called Calisphere. And that is CALIS as in Sam, PHERE. And Calisphere is an online repository of historical photographs from institutions across the state, and is invaluable in speeding up your historical photograph research in many ways, because it concentrates all your results in one place. And what it does is show you results from different repositories, and then you can click through on those individual links to access more information about the photo at their home website. So it's one of the places that we go first when we look at historic photos and we want to find more. A very interesting and in-depth tool for aerial photographs comes from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and they have an online archive called FrameFinder. FrameFinder actually allows you to enter an address into the search bar on the map portal, and it will show you all of the aerial photographs in that area surrounding the address over time, and they are color coded by decade. So it's really exciting to be able, if you're particularly looking for how land patterns or land use shifted over time and you want a larger scale photo, it's one of the best places to look, because there are so many aerials. Many of them are already available for download. The ones that are not are typically available just through a scan. If you email them and ask them to scan, there may be a nominal fee. But those are the primary resources that we go to for photos. And it sounds like we've had a couple questions about the maps too, I know. So maybe what we can do, Molly, is think about a way to make a bibliography online that gives people some links to some of these sources, if that's something that is interest to people.
Sure, we certainly can do that. And we can also work on adding some of these or most of these historic photos to our website. We have some additional questions for you, Heather.
Sure. I'm actually, part of the reason Molly is here is because I rarely get to look at the chat box. And so now I'm actually scrolling. So please tell me what I have missed, Molly.
Well, so I've been answering a few as they come by, but one of our attendees wants to know whether we've visited the Alhambra Historical Society Museum to look at their resources.
We have not, and I'll tell you why. It was not because we didn't want to go. It was in part because when we started the research for this, we were in the thickest part of the pandemic, if we're even out of it. And the museum and the library, most municipal sources, and many of our repositories that you see and that I listed were closed. We were able to access some things based on emailing and asking, whoever was on staff to maybe take some quick photos of us or give us an idea of what was in their collections. But for the most part, we also wanted to accomplish as much as we could on our own, because many of these smaller institutions, those kinds of requests are taxing on the staff at a time when they are operating with very limited resources, and we wanted to respect that. So we kind of thought as we were going along, there might be a point in the process where this would all open back up. And that didn't really occur until we had drafted the outline. So it is something that we have discussed. It's something that's on the table, and we hope to make a visit out there certainly before we finish the project. We were able to locate some sources online that more or less replicated, I think, some of the most valuable narratives that are available at the library and the museum. But we are anxious to see what else we have. And now that things are opening back up and people may feel comfortable with researchers making appointments now, we are anxious to go if we are able and see what we can add to the discussion based on what is there in hard copy only.
So one of our other questions here is, sorry, let me scroll. One of our attendees wants to know what exactly our historic context statement will be used for.
That's a good question. So they can be used for different things. In this case, this is obviously the first step of several towards the city of Alhambra developing its own historic preservation program. Sometimes we have developed historic context statements for cities that already have a preservation program, and we may either be creating a new historic context statement for a particular area, or we may be updating a historic context statement. So this is a really unique and exciting opportunity for us to kind of get in on the ground floor at the very beginning and help inform that process. So ideally, how we would like to see it be used is as, like I said, more of a foundational documentation. We want to be the building blocks on which this program is developed. So we want to make sure that the information that we communicate is accurate and that it communicates the historic significance of various aspects of the built environment in Alhambra. This document really is kind of a foundational building block. So your program will be built on a document like this that gives us enough history and enough understanding of the context of development to help make planning decisions. And those planning decisions may be as simple as what is quote unquote historic, what is eligible for designation. But it also gives us enough information to start making more nuanced decisions as this program evolves and matures about how do we treat these historic properties? How do we treat them from a planning perspective? We're not just talking about what is significant and what isn't, what is eligible and what isn't, but say someone wants to replace the windows on their house. We want to make sure that there is sufficient information that city staff can turn to the document and know what makes a building eligible, what kind of alterations are acceptable, and what appropriate replacements might be based on historic character. And while there's a lot more to that than what you will find in this document, which is very broad, it really is, we want to get enough information together to send people in the right direction. So I hope that it will be supplemented as we go and as you move on in this process with further more specific documentation on some of those practical issues. But this is really kind of the spirit document that helps inform that process in terms of tone and scope and just in general, how we're looking at properties and what is important to the particular story in your town. So it's a first step, but it's an important first step because if we get it wrong, we don't want anyone to go off the rails. So we want to make sure that we have an accurate story that represents everything that is important, both in what you see in terms of visual character, but also in terms of intangible history. So staff has enough information to make comfortable decisions going forward.
we do have an additional question.
Sure.
I'm hoping that the city can help me. Ari Gutierrez Arambula has her hand raised, or his hand raised, I'm sorry. I'm not sure, but I do not have the capability to allow that person to speak.
Ari
I'm
now
here.
has
Can you
the
hear me?
ability to speak.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Hello? Okay, great. I'm using my iPod for the first time to do this.
I
So,
think we are all new to various aspects of the Zoom presentation
I'm like,
tonight, so I
okay.
appreciate your patience.
Yeah, so I wanted to find out about you. One of the maps that you showed
Sure.
was a water map, I think you
The
said.
irrigation map, I think.
Irrigation map.
Let me
And
check that, if it will
so a
let me.
couple points around that is number one, the history of Alhambra in terms of its water history, being able to have its own source. Number one, for the origins of the city, the growth of the city, the independence of the city, the fertile soil associated with the city. But those washes that exist also helped inform kind of some boundaries. And I happen to live right next to one that I believe is historical, and I'll be glad to write all about it to you guys.
Oh, fantastic.
But I want to be able to make sure that you consider those washes as key to the path taken for the growth of the city.
No, I think you raise a really good point. And I will say, I do a lot of landscape history work as well. And so when I started reading, not just about the irrigation and the use of the land, but about those washes, and as far as my understanding goes at this point, how critical they were in defining the areas of development at the time, it definitely sort of piqued my curiosity about how that might have shaped the development in subsequent years, being as the town was sandwiched between these two washes. So if you have
Right.
information on that, we'd be happy to look at it, because I think that's really important. And certainly, from a development perspective, if that's something that should be examined in a closer light, that's really helpful to know.
Right. And the history of all the missions, just like total origin stories, it's all about where the water was. So there's even an old picture of the San Gabriel mission, and there's a water river behind it in that same picture. And that's where I live, right next to that. And
Oh,
so
how lucky you.
yeah, so of course that water's not there anymore, sadly, but we have cement canal now. But anyway, I just think it's such an important thing to consider in terms of why this place was settled in the first place. And Alhambra has special history around water.
No, and please correct me if I'm wrong. One of the things that I had read that I found interesting was that this was one of the few communities that really had managed to develop its own water supply, which is why they were able to charge a premium for land prices, because they were actually running the water lines themselves. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, and I think we did a walk with an urban planner, and we learned a lot from that as well. And when he explained to us that was a key issue, and that if you go back to like the movie Chinatown, it was all about Mulholland, and the San Fernando Valley in LA didn't have their own water source, so they had to pipe it in. But Alhambra had its own own water source, so it was able to exclude itself from that deal. So yeah, it created its own, and of course then the land was rich with nutrients. We had the groves, we had the it was the first Napa Valley. It was Napa Valley before Napa Valley, with grapes and all that stuff. So and of course the indigenous people that were here were already using it for that, and then the Spaniards came, and then they taught them how to more agriculture methods as well. Anyway, all that is an important part of the thing, but it's really interesting how water and those routes really paint the picture of those boundaries of where a city is built and how it grows.
That's fantastic information. I'm so glad you mentioned that. And please, any information that you have on that, I hope you'll submit through the form, because we're anxious to capture some of those intangible things that are evident in the landscape, but might not be apparent, from a built environment standpoint. And it sounds like what you're talking about is one of those things. I know I was really intrigued by the whole discussion that I found of how the water was piped, and they were really coming up with these innovative ideas in water transport and carrying the water to these locations. And they were using different kinds of pipes that had not been used before. And I thought this is really cutting edge. They were actually able to charge quite a premium for parcels in Alhambra because of that water system, which I thought was amazing.
Well, that one statue we have at downtown, at Main Street in Garfield, the statue of the guy, he's the guy who brought the water. So that's how important he was to Alhambra.
I think if we're going to have a statue of anybody, it should be of the guy who brings us water. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. So, but the other interesting thing, and like somebody asked, what is this paper or this structure documentation going to bring to us? I think it should also inform our future. And in terms of, for example, water source, back to water, there's a big water shortage. And so we're going to have to think about how we're going to be able to collect water for our own use or for the area. And perhaps we go back to those original water sources for that. Anyway, it's all very interesting in terms of the arc of history.
I'll tell you, it's really water, because of another project that I've been working on. Water has been a really big issue in a lot of the conversations I've been having lately. And I think it took me some time to realize just on what level it was impacting both, larger properties, institutional properties, and also municipalities who deal with water shortages, and really how that plays out in day-to-day life, and the cost of water, the price of water is something that I'm extremely aware of now. And I think you're right in that, we look to the future and we look at these things and wonder if there are any answers that can be found in our past. And I think if there's anything I can tell you from close reading of things in recent years, it's that if nothing else, we need to learn from the past so we don't repeat it and repeat those same mistakes.
Yeah.
And so I think it's definitely, designing an irrigation system is personally out of my wheelhouse. But I think if there's anything that we can learn, and that's important to communicate in those trends, we're happy to do it. That's what the document is for, is we want to make sure that we have the information that is useful moving forward.
So we have another,
go ahead.
Thanks, Ari.
Sure.
I would like to kind of move us along here a little bit. This is a really interesting discussion, but I want to let other people have a chance to.
I'm so glad someone mentioned water. Thank you for chiming in.
I want to let other people have a chance to speak. So we actually have another raised hand. If we can unmute Melissa Michelson.
She has been unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, I can. Hi, Melissa.
Okay, great, thanks. So I had a question about, I know you have a timeline of 1980.
Yes.
What about, and on the form it talks about people that were, of that time or prior to that time. What about people of modern day in Alhambra that are responsible for kind of maintaining and saving Alhambra's history? Like that these people are really important for all of this, and they still are living. So that's kind of what my question is about. How can we pay homage to them, or how can we recognize them? Because I think they are part of the history of Alhambra history.
Are you thinking of like preservationists? I'm
Yes,
guessing? Okay, I
Yes.
just want to make sure that I understood you correctly before I went off on another tangent.
yeah, preservationists or just important people for bringing you guys to us, or just being involved in all of this, whether it's certain city council members who have spoken out for this, or volunteers in Alhambra Preservation Group, or activists that worked hard to save certain places, whether or not it worked or not, that kind of thing, I think is really important to Alhambra history.
I agree. And this will be a little bit of me thinking out loud, just based on the research that I've seen so far, and you know how we've seen this play out in other areas. I think the interesting thing about preservation and activism is that, you know, when preservation sort of first became a thing, enough time has passed now that we actually can look at that within a historic context. And we can see that there were actually people that were really crucial to that movement on a national level, but also in individual communities. There has been passage of enough time that we can actually look at people preserving history as a historical thing. And I think that's really amazing. But I also think that it's a valuable lesson for us in terms of documentation. One of the things that struck me about a lot of the early histories of Alhambra that I read, and this is true of many towns, but I thought that it was particularly well documented here, is there's a lot of discussion of municipal leaders. And I'm not just talking about the booster men that you see in the photo, but actually really sort of very dry technical discussions of municipal governments, the first, a list of all of the mayors, a list of all of the city councilmen over time. And that may have been something at the time that they thought was just documented for recording purposes. And I come back to that information now, and I'm like, thank God that someone thought to make a list of every city councilman ever, because it's the only place that I have found the name of such and such who owned such and such and did XYZ. And so I'm really grateful for that documentation. It's a challenge for us because obviously we want to look at things within a historical context, but I am absolutely aware of the fact that today is going to be a historical context 20, 30, 50 years from now. So the challenge for us is always, where do we draw the line in documentation for a particular study? And I will say that as we revise this document, we're getting it to a point where we feel comfortable with it. And then you guys are going to see it for the first time. And that may blow everything out of the water, because there will be things that we didn't know about or things that we want to expand upon. So I would say at this point in time, I couldn't make any progress as how far into the present we are able to extend some of those discussions. However, I would love to hear about those people, because it gives us an idea of the trends and patterns. And if it looks as though there's a lot of information about specific areas or specific types of activities, you mentioned activism or people who lobby to save particular buildings, we may look at that and say, hey, this is actually a really significant movement. We should find a way to at least document it in the narrative or mention it, so we have a sense going forward, and people in the future who look back to this document as a historical record will have a starting point for that information. So, well, like I said, I'm not sure we can make any promises, because I'm not sure what form it's going to take until I see more information or suggestions from people. But it's certainly something that we're willing to consider and see if there's a way to treat it in the narrative that that sort of pays homage to that aspect of your history. Because I think the point in time that a city starts to look at its past and start to think about preserving itself is really important. And that's something that we want to capture, certainly. So it's just a question of how we can tell that story and whether or not we're able to tell it in this document. But we certainly want to get it on the record in whatever way we can. So please submit it, and we'll take a look and see what we can do.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we're running towards the end of our questions. I have one that just came in that I'm going to have you answer.
Sure.
But if anybody else wants to ask us questions, now's the time. So, and also if I've missed you, let me know. But Joyce wants to know if we are interested in movies that were filmed here.
Joyce, I would love to know about movies that are filmed here. And I sort of wish that I'd had my camera up for this presentation so you guys could all see how much I talk with my hands and I wave my arms around a lot. And you said movies and I got all excited. I actually, one of the things that I do at HRG is I work on movie studio properties. And we developed the narrative for Survey LA that addresses the role of the motion picture industry in the built environment, and also as one of those aspects of that industry, location filming. I am especially interested in location filming and how shots in real time in real locations helped define the character of certain towns and certain areas. And I think Los Angeles and Southern California is probably the most filmed region in the entire world. And there are so many stories to be told in particular communities about films that were made in those areas, because that was how the industry got started out here, was location filming. So I would be absolutely thrilled to hear anything that you know about movies that were made in the area. And I know there were some that were filmed at the airport. We do not have a comprehensive list, but any information you have, we are happy to take a look at, because that's something that I would love to explore in greater detail.
Okay, well, if that's it, I haven't received any additional questions, so I think that we're good to go, unless anybody wants to ask a final question.
I have scrolled back to the beginning of the chat. I haven't been able to read anything in the middle, but I did scroll back to the beginning and someone suggested the Mid Sherwood book, and I agree, it's fantastic. I read it for my own personal enlightenment when I was doing this context, and it was a great read. So I recommend Days of Vintage, Years of Vision by Mid Sherwood if others of you have not read it. And I think maybe we will try to put up a bibliography since there seems to be some interest. And I just wanted to point that out. I was like, oh, the Mid Sherwood book, this is great. So thank you for all the suggestions. And please, if you have comments, questions, we're happy to stay as long as we need to make sure that they're all answered, because our goal tonight, we are here to learn from you.
It looks like everyone seems to be satisfied, but if you're not, please definitely, send us an email, use the contact us form, go to the get involved page on the website, just visit the website, get involved as much as you want or as little as you want. And
our chat
we'll take
box
it
is
from
open
there.
24/7. We may close up here in 10 minutes, 15 minutes, but our chat box is open 24/7. If you have a historical question that's keeping you up at night, that happens to me as well. But please go ahead and click on the get involved, which I'm trying to scroll back to now, and submit your feelings, submit your comments. We are happy to hear them. Ultimately, we want this document to reflect your community, and we are happy that you care, and we want to make sure that it reflects what is important to you. So please keep the suggestions coming, the comments, even if it's that you want to tell us we did a terrible job, because we want to improve. So we're happy to hear from you in any case. And I thank you for your time tonight. It's really exciting to see so many of you out here, and we appreciate it truly.
Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And this will be available online. We will post this on the city's website as well as the website for the historical page.
Great. Thank you, Mario, for setting this up. This has been fantastic.
No problem. Thank you.